this event, which is a co-sponsored event by the Center for Israel Studies here at the University of Maryland and the Graded Field Committee in Middle East Studies. My name is Peter Wien. I teach history of the modern Middle East in the history department here at Maryland, and I'm also the director currently of the Middle East Studies Graded Field Committee. I'd like to welcome you all to this event. We're happy to collaborate, co-sponsor with the Center for Israel Studies, and thank you for hosting us here in this wonderful building. I'd like to welcome our three speakers, our three guests, Grant Rumley, Amir Tibon, and Shibli Talhami. The occasion for us is to introduce and to discuss a new book that has recently come out, The Last Palestinian, The Rise and Reign of Mahmoud Abbas, which is co-authored by Grant and Amir here on the podium. And I'd like to start by introducing our guests. Before I do this, I'd like to apologize to the panelists before, because I will have to leave at 5:15, a little bit before you probably finish the discussion, so just ignore me when I'm sneaking out. To introduce Grant Rumley. Grant Rumley is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He has published in a number of leading media outlets, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and others. And he is also the author of the 2015 FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, report, The Race to Replace Mahmoud Abbas, Understanding and Shaping Palestinian Succession. Before Grant joined the FDD, he was a visiting fellow at Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. And he also founded, while in Jerusalem, and edited the Jerusalem Review of Near East Affairs. Grant has an MA in Middle East Studies from Hebrew University and a BA in International Relations from Michigan State University. Amir Tibon is an award-winning Israeli journalist who is currently the Washington, D.C. correspondent for Haaretz. He is responsible for covering the Trump administration. That's a very challenging and interesting task. He also covers the U.S.-Israel relationship and the Middle East peace process. His writing on Israel and the Middle East has appeared again in a number of very important news outlets, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, and others. In the past, he has reported from conflict zones in Syria, Ukraine, and southern Turkey. Our own Shibli Talhami doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give one anyway. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development and Director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poland. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His best-selling book, The States, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. And his most recent book is The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. In 2013, he was selected by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, along with the New York Times, as one of the great immigrants. So help me welcome our guests. And I'd like to give the floor to our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
So I go first?
Certainly, because you're talking about the book.
Well, so thanks everyone for coming here today. We're very happy to be here. It's a great honor to share the stage with Shibli. I think we'll talk a bit about how we came to write this book, why it came out now, what were the motivations behind it. We'll obviously have to talk about the title, because every time we talk about the book we get a ton of questions. Why did we call it The Last Palestinian? Talk a bit about Mahmoud Abbas, what should we expect ahead, what might come after him, and then, any questions about the Trump administration will be also welcome to answer. I'll start by talking about the idea for the book. In 2015, Grant and I published an article together in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Death and Life of the Two-State Solution. We talked a bit about some of the current trends in Palestinian politics. And after the article received some positive reactions, we thought, well, maybe, if we wrote a 10,000-word article and some smart people thought it was okay, we should try to write a book together, because you basically take that and multiply by a number of, an expanded number of articles. And we had all kinds of ideas. I won't bore you to death with the list of ideas, but we realized that we need to do some research and reading in order to fulfill those ideas. And we said, all right, first of all, we need to find a good biography of Mahmoud Abbas, because if we want to write this expansive book about the peace process and Palestinian politics, Abbas is going to be a main player. At that point, we discovered, to our delight and shock at the same time, that there has never been a biography of Mahmoud Abbas. This man has been leading the Palestinian Authority since 2005, and he's been a prominent figure in Palestinian national politics for decades, and an important person when it comes to the US-led peace process. Yet nobody has ever bothered to sit down and write a biography of him, not in Arabic, not in English, not in Hebrew, not in Russian. You know, he had some important things to do with Russia in his past. And that's when we said, okay, maybe we'll put these other ideas we have on the shelf and we'll go and do some real, actual research and write the first ever biography about this very influential leader and negotiator and politician. That it's about time he will have his own biography. He actually did not cooperate with the writing of the book. We reached out to some of the closest people around him, and what we heard was that they would like to have editorial oversight over the book, which was something we could not accept. But we did manage to talk to a lot of people who had very, very close relationships with him over the years, from the Palestinian side, Israeli, the American, other Arab countries in the region. And I think we got an interesting and very colorful and full of anecdotes picture about him. And the book came out in July. And now, as you see, there is at least some interest, to some extent. So we're happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I will echo Amir's comments and also say it's a delight to be here at the Big Ten's newest university and or its newest member in the Big Ten as a fellow Big Ten Spartan myself, and obviously to share the stage with Dr. Telhami is a delight. The Peace Puzzle was my Bible in graduate school, and so it's just a thrill to be here. I think Amir and I approach writing about Palestinian politics almost in an academic sense of simply trying to explain it in a sense, and outside of the lens of the peace process, which I think, especially in Washington, the dialogue about Palestinian politics typically reverts to what offers they walked away from or what offers they rebuffed and whatnot. But there's a whole world of politics there. There's mechanisms, there's bodies, there's policymaking processes that are myriad and confusing, but also fascinating. And they also, like any other leader in any other country, compel a leader and affect his or her decision-making process. And so that was the impetus for us behind the article in 2015, where we were basically seeing a growing number of younger Palestinians express support for a different school of thought from their political elders, more support for the one man, one vote. And that was fascinating to us. And that was also the impetus behind writing the book about Abu Mazen. Was no one's written a book about him, and everyone seems to have written a book about Arafat. And so if we could kind of go into this and better understand his life, his arc, maybe we would get some answers on some of the offers that he was involved with. Maybe we would also take a sort of humble contribution to the debate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe this would be a starting point for better understanding Palestinian politics. And so that was our driving impetus. And I think when we started it, I don't know if we really had a firm idea of how we saw his life in whole. I think it's especially hard for us to judge any other person, but certainly to conclude about a Palestinian leader's life is certainly obviously difficult. But I think we sort of looked at him as a guy who's a bit of a tragic figure. And this resonated, and this really sort of came through with a lot of our interviews, with talking with people around him. Here was a guy who's really lived the arc of the modern Palestinian national movement, from being born in Safed in 1935 to experiencing 1948 at the age of 13, to living in Jordan briefly, then Syria, then Doha, to joining with Fatah and the PLO early on, and being part of the PLO in exile, and then orchestrating Oslo, orchestrating the peace talks, and orchestrating the return, the creation of the PA, and then succeeding Arafat. I mean, that is really the arc of modern Palestinian nationalism in a lot of ways. And consistently throughout his life, he had been someone committed to nonviolence and someone committed to back-channel negotiations. I think he saw early on that conflicts end in negotiations, and that's why he sort of positioned himself as the quote-unquote negotiator within the PLO. I also think inherently he's not a violent person. He was washed out of a Syrian military camp at the age of 18 after a couple of months. They just told him he didn't have the fighting spirit. I think he's always sort of seen a value to nonviolence, or a commitment at least. And there's a whole other debate about the activities of the PLO and his complicity, but in general his policies. I think he's not a guerrilla fighter. He's not someone who was in the camps, and that would later bite him later. And so if you kind of zoom out and think about what's the driving thesis here of this book, it's that he is sort of a tragic figure. He is the reason the Palestinians are negotiating. I mean, he is the driving force for the Palestinian embrace of the two-state idea, of the reason they went to Oslo, of the reason the PA was created. And he comes to power in 2005 after Arafat, and all the skills that sort of made him a negotiator, of someone who was a capable bureaucrat, they also don't translate to being the type of leader that can compel people to support your policies. He doesn't practice the type of retail politics that Arafat was famous for. He doesn't go into the camps. He doesn't have sort of an open door policy. He's a little more closed off. And it are those weaknesses that are exacerbated in 2006, and it's those weaknesses that are further exacerbated in 2007 when he loses Gaza. And it's those weaknesses that we sort of look at him today. And so if you look at his life and you think, well, where's the tragedy? The tragedy is that this is a guy who basically rose to power, pledging diplomacy and negotiations, the two-state solution, comes to power, and has his legitimacy cut in half. And everything after that is really about self-preservation, first and foremost. And I think that's where we come at this, is understanding his actual fears, his actual paranoia, his aversion to risk. All those are how you can look at offers in 2008, offers in 2014, and everything's sense in a way. And so that, to us, basically hammers home this idea that he's going to be looked at as a missed opportunity, and in large part a tragic figure because of that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, first of all, I'm really glad that you did this, because frankly there isn't any, as you pointed out, and somebody has to start, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there and a lot of insights, and it's all in one place, and that's really extremely helpful. And I know that as you wrote this, you were expecting, given the polarization right now, especially on this issue, that you're going to get criticism, political criticism that's not justified necessarily, which is from the extreme Israeli right, that this is not critical enough of Mahmoud Abbas, or you're going to get it certainly from Palestinians, that this is not sensitive enough to their narrative, that this reads more like a moderate Israeli-American account than it is a reflection of the Palestinian context. And I'll put that aside. It's not the path I want to take. I want instead to kind of engage some of the things that are in there and put them in some perspective. I'll do that with some reflection. I'm not a biographer of Mahmoud Abbas. I know a lot about him, obviously, including his childhood in Safed, and even some of his neighborhood from Safed. I know that. I've met him a number of times, and a few times when we had extensive conversations that lasted a couple of hours. So I have a little bit of impression of him personally, and I've certainly met Arafat many times, and I can contrast the two pretty well in terms of how they come across. However, I come at it more from, as a student of this issue. Obviously, it was published on it, was done a lot of research on it. You mentioned the peace puzzle took us 6 years to piece all that stuff together, just talking about the politics of what has been called the peace process. 5 of us working hard to do it. And also as a practitioner, I've advised every single American administration since Bush Sr. in 1990 through Obama, as a senior advisor on the Middle East, and in the Obama administration was specifically on this issue. And as someone who, behind the scenes, led some track 2 diplomacy, bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. And so in some sense, I have I'm coming at it from that perspective rather than from what Israelis are going to say, what Palestinians are going to say, or even what Americans are going to say, just more from that perspective. And here I think there are a couple of issues that you certainly don't mean, but one has to alert people not to come across with the wrong conclusion. And they have to do a lot with the context itself. And that is sort of, what is the context of, you focused on Mahmoud Abbas. Obviously that's what the book is, it's a biography. But Mahmoud Abbas is the whole story. You're reviewing events that were so central to interpreting Mahmoud Abbas. Whether it's the actual negotiations, the crisis with Hamas, or the internal trouble within Fatah, or the crisis with the US. Those things define what he does, but you can't do that justice, because this is a book that is essentially a journalistic account of Mahmoud Abbas. And you mention these things, but in passing, and you don't do them justice. And in that sense, someone could come with the wrong conclusion. And for example, when you say that, particularly in 2014 or earlier, he had a couple of opportunities that he sort of, quote, failed to capture. It's sort of a nice, thing to summarize and take away as, a failed leader. He failed to exploit opportunities. I think that's just not justified. Not because Mahmoud Abbas is not a flawed man. He's a flawed man. And he's a flawed leader. And I can give you, and I'll go over some of the issues that I think are essential flaws, including ones that you don't focus on in the book. But the reality of it is that the main failure of the peace process, what we call the peace process, has nothing to do with Mahmoud Abbas per se, or has little to do. I don't want to say nothing to do. Of course it has something to do. Every leader has a responsibility, and he's partly responsible. But the failure is not, even if you had a magician as a Palestinian leader, you're not going to have it. And as Aaron Miller says in his introduction, it would be unrealistic for Israelis to expect someone better suited to making a deal than Mahmoud Abbas, with all his flaws, again, acknowledging all of that. And certainly it didn't happen. So to expect him to be a Mandela or a Sadat or even a Arafat is totally, doesn't, I think, even capture what Mandela or Sadat or even Arafat had to bring to the table. Anwar Sadat was not considered even to be charismatic. He was dismissed until the 73 war. It took him the 73 war to put himself on the map for people to take him seriously and start thinking this guy's charismatic. He was a joke early on from 1970 through 73. He had a lot to go to Jerusalem. The profound thing wasn't just that he went to Jerusalem. The profound thing is that he was capable of carrying out an effective war against Israel, nearly defeated Israel in the first week in 1973. And just a few years before that. So he was bringing the leverage and power of the mightiest Arab state that was capable of fighting a war with Israel, and he was putting that on the table. That's what made him a great. It's not because he was just personally a smart leader or a good leader. He didn't deliver that. No one would have taken him seriously. Mandela was offered to be the leader of all of South Africa, white and black. It's still incredible that he actually went and said to the whites, "I'm going to forgive all of the horrible things that you did to the blacks, and I want to open my arms to them." That's an extraordinary thing. I don't dismiss it. I think it's unbelievable. He's one of my heroes, and as you know, we hosted him here. He gave my Sadat lecture in 2001, right here on this campus. We had over 10,000 people for him at that time. So he's one of my heroes, but he had a different leverage he was bringing to the table. So what does Abu Mazen bring to the table? He is a head of an authority that doesn't really have full authority. He is under Israeli control. Israeli troops can go over into Ramallah, and they can also close the Muqatta'a, as they did with Arafat, his predecessor. The Arab world has been going through upheavals, particularly since 2011, with the Palestinian issue marginalized and ignored. And the United States, it spins its wheels, but not really putting any lever on the peace process. And so, and more than that, obviously, is you've had, when he first made his deal with Israel, it was when you had Yitzhak Rabin in office. You had a different Israeli government, you had a different package put on the table, and he grabbed it. And he's the one who urged Arafat to grab it. He's the one who negotiated, as you described pretty well in the book. But he's had Bibi Netanyahu. He's had a government of people, many of whom don't accept the idea of a two-state solution. He's had no success at all at stopping the settlements, even when he was doing concessions. And even despite all of that, he did manage to prevent Palestinians in the West Bank from adopting a violent option. Now that would have been, he's doing that selfishly. A lot of people, he gets criticism from Palestinians that he's sort of a tool of Israeli government, that he's only making, he's a policeman for Israel, he's legitimizing the occupation, he's doing all of that. But in the end, he did it anyway. And I think he did it not because he felt he needed it vis-a-vis Israel, but he believed that the violent option is not good for the Palestinians, that they would stand to lose. That if you go into violent confrontation, you lose two things. You lose the legitimacy internationally, and of course, given the asymmetry of power on the ground, Palestinians will pay a heavier price. And he managed to do that. So his accomplishments, I'll talk about them in a minute, as well as the weaknesses, but I want to go through a couple of things about the context and why there are a lot of things that are missing in there, even aside from this kind of putting the big picture of the power distribution that even a magical leader could not have overcome, a Palestinian leader. But I'll give you an example of one thing you describe in the book, and connect it a little bit to what I see are some of Abu Mazen's flaws or weaknesses that made him somewhat less effective, both among Palestinians, but possibly internationally. Not so much responsible for failure of peace, because you got to put that aside. I think a question of how he's going to be remembered, I don't really think of him as a tragic figure, frankly. We can come back to that and maybe have a discussion about that. But just to give you an example dating back to Oslo, where his role obviously is central. He probably, a lot of people felt he should have been one to have had a piece of that peace prize that went to 3 people and didn't want to give it to 4. And certainly was given to 2 Israelis, but 1 Palestinian. And he was there, obviously, at the White House. I was there, as many of us, maybe some other people there at the White House in 1993, the White House lawn, when that agreement was signed. But you refer to 2 Palestinians, Ahmed Khalidi and Hussein Agha, who were seen as Abu Mazen's men, who were then introduced and do particularly start negotiating with the Israelis in 1994. That's when you were starting with the deadline. Well, that's not the way it worked out. I mean, initially. Ahmed Khalidi and Hussein Agha were part of a track to American Academy of Arts and Sciences effort. I was on the American side of that effort with Everett Mendelsohn. We had brought together Ahmed Khalidi, Hussein Agha, and 3 Israelis, General Shlomo Gazit, Ze'ev Shif, the late Ze'ev Shif from Haaretz, the military correspondent, and there was a 3rd Israeli as well. I'll remember in a minute. But we initiated this contact where they were talking to Arafat and actually communicating with Arafat, not with Abu Mazen, in Tunis. And we were meeting in 1992. We started the meetings in 1992. We actually went to Tunis and met with Arafat in that year. Then we were meeting behind the scenes in Europe. meeting that led to, in my own opinion, to a breakthrough in my mind that an agreement was possible, happened very early. I think it may have been January 1993, before that Oslo track took hold. We met in Rome. It was the Israeli side, plus in addition to Ahmed Khalidi and Hussein Ala, Arafat sent his security advisor, Nizar Ammar. That was a surprise that Arafat sent, because this was a track too. We had no official, there was no official Israeli. So Arafat surprised people by sending Nizar Ammar. Nizar Ammar put something on the table that was extraordinary. Shlomo Gazit had come to the table with a paper. His paper was based, those of you who followed the story then, there was a lot of upheavals in Gaza, there was a lot of pressure on the Israelis to pull out of Gaza. And Shlomo Gazit did a paper which is said, let's do unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. That was something that he put on the table at that time. He had published it even publicly. He put that out publicly, and he came to sell that to the Palestinians and said, look, we're going to do this, but why don't we coordinate so that you will hurt less and we will hurt less. Let's do some benefit, but we're going to do this. We're going to pull out. So Nizar Ammar came, and his message from Arafat was very surprising. He said, we accept Gaza first. That's what he said. And he said, we accept Gaza first, but there are two conditions. One condition was that it give us a signal that it's not Gaza only. They didn't have the Jericho idea baked, but we want to make sure it's not a Gaza only, it's a Gaza first. But the second thing, and the most important thing that Nizar Ammar talked about at length, was that Hamas has taken over Gaza, in our opinion, and we want to prevent them. We think they're going to take the cause back. So our main condition is for the PLO to be allowed to go in there to root out Hamas. And I say this because, a number of things. One is there's a context here not only about, who was doing what, that Arafat himself was authorizing these channels, including with those two men, the Londoners, and sending his own emissary to do that. But I say this also because to understand what happened later with Hamas, and Abu Mazen's really is not Abu Mazen, it's Fatah's approach to Hamas. You have to understand that this was seen to be a zero-sum game, that he was willing to make a deal with Israel at a time when there was no real deal on the table, sending an emissary to say, we need to defeat Hamas. And that's one reason why we want to go to Gaza, to make it possible. What happened was, in the when Hamas obviously became more popular in the 2000s, and then they took over in Gaza. One of Abu Mazen's big failures is that he never figured out how to develop a policy to deal with the obvious popularity of Hamas among certain Palestinian circles, while really being in principle opposed to ever making peace with them. His public wanted the peace. Fatah saw them as the enemy, just like now you have this break in the Arab world between the Muslim Brotherhood and its opponents. People saw them as just completely out of the paradigm. They can't, that's not the case. And he could never figure out, I'm not sure that Arafat figured out how to deal with it. He dealt with it a little bit better, but Abu Mazen couldn't figure out how to deal with it. That was certainly one of his failures as he moved forward. Let me talk about a couple of other failures that I see in his, or weaknesses in the way he dealt with it. And I'm not talking here about corruption and charisma and things of that sort. They're there. There's corruption there. I don't think that's the reason we don't have peace. I don't think that's his biggest failing. I think, particularly if you compare it to the region and to much of the world right now, that is not something that particularly stands out. I mean, it's there. So what are the other failings? Number one, I am not sure that what you call charisma is the issue for him. I already said that charisma is somewhat built on what you can deliver, and of course Arafat was not only a leader, he was a movement founder, and he was also a flag. He became a flag. It's a symbol. It's not just even about what he stood for, what he did. He became the symbol. With even his picture became the symbol of the Palestinians. But Arafat was a completely different guy. Why? Because Arafat was a politician in a way that Abu Mazen never was. Abu Mazen is an elitist. He's a top-down guy. Arafat, while neither one of them took public opinion all that seriously, Arafat paid more attention to it. It mattered to him. Abu Mazen dismissed it. Arafat would write personal checks and send them to a widow and call her on the phone. He did the kind of stuff that American politicians do with their constituents day in and day out. Arafat did that on a regular basis. Arafat had a certain charming touch to him in dealing with people that you don't see with Abu Mazen at all. Abu Mazen is aloof. He's distant. He's not. So people talk about Hillary Clinton versus Bill Clinton. About the sort of where's the warmth. There is that. There's definitely that in the makeup. There is another really major problem for Abu Mazen, which is that he did not protect the relationships with Arab rulers well enough. And I think that is extremely important because Palestinians often took Arabs for granted because they're supposed to support you, and therefore if Arabs didn't support, they kind of criticized them or in the field. Arafat played that sometimes well, sometimes not too well. He failed with Saddam Hussein in Iraq and lost the Gulf states, and there was a time when he was isolated and weak. Mahmoud Abbas is a president who kept amicable relations with everyone, but did not consolidate strategic alliances with anyone. If you look now and you say, who's Mahmoud Abbas's key ally in the Arab world, it's hard to know who that would be. There's at a time when it's shifting. That is a major problem for him. But he has two successes that can tell us something about what to expect. Despite all of the flaws, he had two successes. One success is what we talked about, that he actually prevented a violent outburst in the West Bank. It's not a small accomplishment under the circumstances, and not one that we could bet that will continue. But the second is that at a time when interest in Palestine had declined because of all the shifts that had taken in the Arab world, because of the growing asymmetry of power between Israel and the Palestinians, he nonetheless kept the Palestinian issue alive in the international community. He established a sense of legitimacy that now is reflected not only in some votes in the UN across the board, but also in public opinion polling. The Obama Act, as he left, which was to restate in a way previous international resolutions on the issue, but nonetheless to reframe the questions, to create a sense that international resolutions, UN resolutions, international positions, prior agreements are the framework for negotiations, is one of his biggest accomplishments. Now, we are now in a situation where he's facing a peace plan from Trump administration has no framework reference at all, that wants to do away with reference to prior agreements, reference to the UN resolutions, reference to anything at all, just to talk more practical about what could be implemented on the ground. And that is one reason why it's impossible for Abu Mazen to play, separate from the terms of what might come. But the precedent of Abu Mazen accepting a new way of doing business, which doesn't refer to his principal accomplishment in international relations, is really hard to see. And that's one reason I think why he's in a big bind, where even though some people are pressuring him to engage the ideas that Trump is putting on the table, it's not just the ideas that he's rejecting. It is the form that goes against everything that he's accomplished. And with that.
So I'll say a bit of our view when it comes to 2014 and some of the issues that you mentioned. When you talk about Abbas and the peace process, there are two, I would say, main points that are being directed towards him as points of criticism. One is 2008, when Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, comes to him and basically puts a map in front of him for a final status peace agreement and tells him, let's go in 48 hours to the UN together and sign this peace agreement and it will end the conflict. And Abbas, for reasons that we actually in the book kind of, I won't say justify, but sympathize with and explain, decides not to take it. And the second point is 2014 with Obama. We make a very strong distinction in the book between 2008 and 2014. 2008, this is an offer coming from Olmert, who at the time has an approval rating of about 10% with the Israeli public, who is months away from a criminal indictment and really running on the fumes of his own legitimacy as a prime minister. And Abbas, smartly, according to even some of his critics in Israel and the United States, decides not to take it. He's also getting messages at the same time from other Israeli politicians like Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak. Well, basically, you know, he's getting all these signals that if he waits, maybe there will be a better government for him in Israel that will have more legitimacy to do the deal. 2014, it's a different situation. 2014, Obama has a meeting with Abbas in the White House. Actually, I think it happened, 4 years ago tomorrow, the 6th, I think 16th of March. And they meet in the White House. This is after John Kerry has spent months upon months drafting up this peace plan. And Abbas saw one version of the plan in February of that year in Paris and decided that it's not suitable because the language on Jerusalem was very vague and weak, and because it seemed to adopt some of Netanyahu's positions on security issues and settlements in a way that Abbas said, I cannot accept it. After that meeting in Paris, the Americans basically decided to shift the document to give it stronger language on Jerusalem and on refugees and on borders and security and a number of parameters. And Abbas and Obama are now in the White House, and Obama presents the new document to him and basically tells him, you're not going to get a better offer from an American president than this one. He basically tells him, don't think about this detail or that detail, think about the broader picture. The occupation will end, the Palestinian people will have independence and will have statehood, and the entire situation that they live in will be completely different. And he really encourages him to do it, and he tells him, you are not going to have an American president more supportive of the Palestinian position than me, Obama. And Abbas, for reasons that we also discuss in the book, basically decides he didn't say no to Obama's offer, he didn't say yes. He just left it there, and we came to a conclusion, and we can argue about it, but I think it's very reasonable to say that this was a different situation than with Olmert. With Olmert, I think Abbas looked at a very weak Israeli prime minister, giving him an offer that did not really have a strong footing, whereas here he's sitting with Obama, American president, that at that point in time had 2.5 years left to his term. At that point in time still had a majority in the Senate, was strongly committed to this issue, and had already showed in different arenas that he was willing to have some kind of confrontations with Netanyahu. And I think if Abbas had gone along with this offer with Obama, the pressure that would have been put on Netanyahu would have been very significant. I can tell you, as someone who covered Netanyahu at the time, that when the Israeli government realized that Abbas had not accepted Obama's plan, Netanyahu basically celebrated. They were, I don't know if literally, but they were opening champagne in the metaphorical sense.
We know they open champagne a lot. So.
Yes, they actually open a lot of champagne bottles in that place, it's true. And I know that for Obama it was a big disappointment. By the way, this meeting in 2014, it was the last time that Obama hosted Abbas in the White House. They never had a one-on-one meeting ever since. Abbas visited the White House again in May 2017, but that was with Trump. And I think that Obama's warning, you know, you're not going to have a more supportive president, you're not going to get a better offer, at least when we look at the current American administration, it looks kind of prophetical. I don't think Obama ever imagined that he would be replaced by Donald Trump, certainly not in March 2014. But, you know, 2.5 years later, that's exactly what happened. And even if it wasn't Trump, even if it was Hillary Clinton, or Marco Rubio, or Jeb Bush, I'm skeptical that they would look at this plan that Obama presented to Abbas in March 2014 and said, you know what, let's take this plan and make it even a little better for the Palestinians. Let's add a few components that would actually improve the Palestinian view of the plan. I think most chances they would have tried to roll it back. And that's why we do make a clear distinction between 2008 that, in my opinion, it's not exactly fair to say that Abbas missed a big opportunity for peace in that negotiation versus 2014, which I think, you know, if he had said yes to Obama, we have no idea what would have happened to Netanyahu, even if his own government at the time would have survived, because back then Netanyahu did not have the same coalition he has today, which, you know, today the Israeli coalition is so right-wing, there's no chance it will support any kind of agreement, doesn't matter what Trump puts on the table. Back then, in Netanyahu's coalition, you had two big parties. Together they had 25 seats. You know, Lapid's party and Livni's party was very supportive of the Kerry process. Even Avigdor Lieberman, you know, one of the more hawkish, right-wing, racist people in the government, was very supportive of the Kerry effort at the time, said we need to go along with it. So that's why I think there is a distinction there. When it comes to the issue of the negotiations in 94, 95, since the book is focused on Abbas, we did not focus on all the secret channels that took place. We focused on what we call the Beilin Abu Mazen channel, which, you know, his name is the headline of it because of his involvement, and how that negotiation actually came very close to producing an agreement. And one of the things that we heard from people who were involved is that at that point in time, Abbas proved to be a very open, flexible, and courageous negotiator. And, you know, if you look at the Beilin Abu Mazen agreement, there were significant Palestinian concessions in that document that I'm not sure any Palestinian leader in the future will agree to make. And the Israelis who were involved in the Beilin Abu Mazen channel really came to admire Abbas, even though the actual talks were with the Londoners, not with Abu Mazen himself. But they came to admire him for how he managed that negotiation. But there is an argument that you can make or maybe ask, is it easier to negotiate an agreement in some kind of a vacuum, in a track 2 channel with unofficial Israelis? In those talks, you had the same people from Oslo, Ron Pundak and Hirschfeld and Nimrod Novik, who close to Paris, but not in an official capacity at the time. And on the Palestinian side, Hussein and Ahmed Khalidi, and this is in a kind of a vacuum. Yeah. The real question is, can you reach the same kind of concessions from both sides when there is a real consequence to every word that is being said, because it's a leader and a leader sitting together? And I think, unfortunately, we've seen that the same conditions that happened with Beilin Abu Mazen didn't happen in later official negotiations.
Well, first off, I want to thank you for your comments. I always learn something when I read you or listen to you. And if I wasn't so proud of being a Michigan Stater, I would have liked to have studied here, certainly, and be able to benefit from that. And I'll address two of the broad sort of critiques of the book. The first, as I read it, correct me if I'm wrong, is structural. The idea of context and the scope of the book. that is largely our fault in that if Abbas is a pretty shrewd negotiator, we're not when it comes to book publishers. And so I think when we pitched this book, Amir and I first proposed a year to a year and a half, and I certainly had visions of a Yazid Saik sort of masterpiece tome, and they came back with 6 months and a certain amount of words, and so that in and of itself shifts it into very much, as you say, a journalistic, almost oral history of Abbas. As you know, I spent about 6 weeks in the West Bank on 3 separate trips. Amir was in Israel, and we're both back and forth in DC, basically getting a hold of everyone we could to sort of put together this oral history, not being able to sort of access archives and go through and do a history of Hamas's evolution in the First Intifada and the rivalry with Fatah. And so I think we were writing with the view of sort of throwing a lot of that context very quickly onto the readers so that they could get to the second part, and that is the view of Abbas. You know, it's not our place to say that we wanted him to be a Mandela, that we thought he should be some sort of revolutionary leader. I'm an Irish-Italian guy from Michigan. Amir's an Israeli. It's not our place at all to say what we think another leader should be. I barely understand Michigan politics. What we're trying to do, and what we tried to do in the book, was explain the different decisions he made. And why he made those decisions, but also sort of give him some agency. And so yes, the overall status quo is tilted against him in his favor, and yes, there are greater events like the Arab Spring, there are greater events like the Israelis and the Americans, but there are also moments where he sort of charts his own course. There are moments like his speech as prime minister in Aqaba where he doesn't mention Arafat, and Arafat's under siege in Ramallah, and it creates a storm for him at home. There are little things like his presidential campaign, you know, the Quranic slogan he chooses, "Alladhi at'amahum min ju'in wa amanahum min khawf," you know, these things that he tries to resonate and connect with the people. And then there are moments ahead of 2006 with the electoral battle against Hamas, where his party basically splits in front of him, where he cannot sort of wrangle the guys like Marwan Barghouti and the Dahlanists and Rajub and these sort of fractured lists. He can't really navigate his own, as you say, it's Fatah's politics in a lot of ways. And you know, and that is sort of something where we basically wanted to chart these data points. His party's conference in 2009, his consolidation of party, his party's conference in 2016, I attended, where he forced out the Dahlanists. He cut about 1,000 people from the attendee list. He had purged certain members from different camps from the Revolutionary Council. He pushed members out of the Central Committee. All these sort of things he does behind the scenes that we don't think are exposed enough or talked about enough, that ultimately, as Amir just stated, impact his standing in 2008, his standing in 2014, his standing with the Israelis and with the regional leaders. And so all of that, not with a lens of, you know, what he should or should not do, but simply with what he has done. And what will that mean for the next leader? What will that mean for the trajectory of Palestinian politics? Did he just provide a blueprint, or did he provide an anomaly? These are all sort of open-ended questions. So I think that was sort of the driving focus and impetus for us in writing the book. That's what we tried to accomplish.
No, it's good. And let me just also be clear about the context that I talked about. I don't think you could have gotten into the context. I'm not saying you should have done it, because it's not something you could have done, frankly. I was just saying that when people reading it, they should understand there is a context, and that the conclusions that are drawn about his failures should be put in perspective, meaning that he was a flawed leader, and all of what you said about his failures within Fatah, his failure even to play to Palestinian public opinion, his failure to build relations in the region, they matter a lot for the way he did business, for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestinian society, for the Palestinian economy. But they played only a small role in the failure of the peace process. That the failure of the peace process is not principally based on that. And that even if he'd done all the things right, he still would have probably not succeeded at getting it, because the game that was being played was way bigger than him. And his leverage was so small, and the current Israeli government was so intent in not giving him the minimum. And the Obama administration, to go back to the 2014, as I said, I was a senior advisor to them, the first administration, on this very issue. And I supported Obama, right? And but he had his own failures on this issue that had nothing to do with Israeli, Palestinian, and other leaders about even understanding the priorities or what it entails to take a position publicly and not follow through, particularly after that first year. So by 2014, Obama had a lot of strikes against him in the region, not only among Palestinians, but as you know, among the region broadly. And more importantly, his top priority was not this issue. And this was Kerry's game. His top priority was the Iran deal. By far, he thought that he needs to prevent war with Iran, otherwise we'd be on a slippery slope. He needed to make this deal. And his biggest opposition in the world is the Prime Minister of Israel. And he's got support among the Republicans in Congress. And Bibi becomes part of the domestic American political game. So to expect him to be able to wield any leverage with Bibi on this issue at the time is just something that is, so we can play with this and say, well, I would have preferred it if Mahmoud Abbas had accepted what was put on the table. Okay, maybe, I don't know. I mean, you can go back and forth. It's an arguable point. It's not something that I would dismiss. But frankly, looking at it from where I'm sitting, that is not the reason why we failed. And go back to what Martin Indyk said, I think, in your newspaper, right? He was the special envoy. Who did he blame privately for the failure of the peace process? It wasn't Mahmoud Abbas. He blamed the Prime Minister of Israel. And obviously, to this day, there's anger with him. Look at Kerry's speeches. His departure speech or the speech at the Brookings one that you probably were there for the Saban Forum, where he gave this speech in which he basically pinned the blame principally on the Israeli side. So that's one of them, and that's coming from people who probably understand Israel far better than they understand the Palestinians and are sympathetic. So we have to understand that in understanding Mahmoud Abbas and his flaws. And he, as I say, he's a flawed man. He made a lot of them. And the extent to which he has any legitimacy at the popular level is a question to raise right now. But with all of that, he could not have delivered under the circumstances, in my own opinion. And the failure is not because of his flaws. Maybe we could have had a miracle, the miracle maker, but I just don't think so. I mean, that's so. I'm not dismissing what the weaknesses that you articulate or some of the decisions that are flawed, but placing it in the big picture where people shouldn't go away thinking like they did with Arafat and the Camp David, of course, in 2000, they failed because of Yasser Arafat. No, Yasser Arafat made a mistake, and we addressed that thoroughly in the Peace Puzzle in our book. But that also is a flawed narrative, and we don't want to create a new narrative that Mahmoud Abbas is the reason why they failed in 2008 and 2014. I think that would be a mistake, and it would not be a service for. That's not what you're arguing, but it's important for people to know that that's not the conclusion to draw from that.
Should we open up for questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is very fascinating, the exchange. I have a question about the negotiations themselves, because I'm wondering whether, all of these negotiations, 1990s, 2000s, and since, are these ever eye-level negotiations that take place? And I'm asking the question from a number of perspectives. Well, the first one would be an objective perspective. I mean, can you consider these eye-level negotiations? There we have really two equal partners. I would also like to ask you whether you think they are from the perception, from the perspective of those who participate in eye-level negotiations. Does Mahmoud Abbas ever go into these negotiations with the expectations that he can expect a fair deal to come out of this? Or is there something, like a baggage of almost a century of history and experiences, his own experiences, but also the experiences of his people? Will is there ever the possibility for him to assume that this is an absolutely fair context in which he moves? And also from the other side, from Obama, but also from good-willing Israeli negotiators, do they automatically assume that these are eye-level negotiations, even though it might be impossible for the other side to assume that in the same way? Is there, in general, a disconnect in the way how people perceive the chances, possibilities, the leeway which they have in these negotiations?
I think everyone knows what the balance of power is. Like Shibli said, it's very obvious. And I don't think nobody who deals with the issue thinks that you really have a situation where the Palestinians come into negotiations with Israel, and the field is totally leveled and everyone comes from the same place. I don't think there is an expectation like that. It doesn't mean you can't reach some kinds of agreements. All the agreements that have been reached came under these circumstances. You can argue if they were good or bad agreements, if they were helpful for the situation or not, but they were all reached from this circumstance. I've heard some people make the argument that maybe you need to create some kind of a Palestinian state on temporary borders just to enter the negotiations from a position of two states and then negotiate, let's say, borders and specific elements. I don't know if it's a good or a bad idea. It might be a superficial attempt to level the situation where, in reality, Israel would still be out of the two participants, that one that is asked to make more concessions and the one that also holds more of the power. But that's just certainly the situation. And I think it will be, I don't see any Israeli leader agreeing to enter the negotiations after the issues that create this reality have been resolved, because from the Israeli point of view, those are the issues that need to be negotiated in the first place.
I think it's fair to say that when Palestinians enter I don't see a negotiation, because this hasn't been really so much direct negotiations, much mediation by the U.S. But if they're entering into a mediation effort by the U.S. for the purpose of achieving an agreement, they typically expect the U.S. to put the ideas on the table. In fact, one of the reasonable criticism of Palestinians is that they have not been initiative takers, and that's not just Abu Mazen, by the way. At Camp David in 2000, one of the criticisms of Arafat, okay, what do you have for me? And he didn't put forth counter arguments or counter ideas. They didn't develop ideas to put on the table. The Israelis often do. Sometimes they do it indirectly by getting somebody to put their ideas on the table. But the Palestinians certainly have kind of an expectation the U.S. is going to put it. They go, I think, very often optimistic. When Obama started, they certainly were optimistic about what he had said before, and they were prepared to listen. And they liked Mitchell when he was appointed, and the reception was good, and they were prepared to engage. Even with Trump, I mean, look at what happened here. I mean, this is a president who obviously was unknown and had said some contradictory things, but when Mahmoud Abbas came here, and I saw him when he came to meet with Trump here, they were open-minded. They were, I think, somewhat optimistic, guardedly optimistic. They saw the limits, but they wanted to engage. But pretty soon, I think they're disappointed, because I think the expectations that an American president is going to pay a heavy political price for them is just not justified, and I think it never was. And even with Obama, and Obama had a reason to say, well, you're not going to get anybody who's going to be more sympathetic. He was personally, at a very close level, sympathetic to them, but it wasn't a priority issue for them, and there are lots of different reasons why American politicians get frustrated with them. Why? Because when they go, they would think that the biggest allies of the Palestinians will be the Arab leaders. They go to meet with the Arab leaders, and these Arab leaders rarely ever raise the question of Palestine. They want bilaterals, they want deals, and when the U.S. asks them to do something on the Palestinian front, they're reluctant for a variety of reasons. So I know that Obama was very frustrated with that, both with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Egyptians, with everyone on this issue. And that usually, then there is a kind of a backlash. And with the frustration with Mahmoud Abbas is, are you going to take the political risk, or am I going to take the political risk? You want to, yeah, it's risky for you to do it, but if you're not going to do it, then why do you expect me, the President of the United States, to risk my own politics when it's my number one issue? And that creates a different kind of relationship that's not very healthy.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that just building off that, there's also sort of this calculus right now within Abbas's circles that they expect the U.S. to extract concessions from the Israelis for them, in a way. And so I was a week after the election in Ramallah with Abbas Zaki, one of these senior Fatah leaders, and he was pretty happy with the election. And he said, yeah, because Trump will be able to get the Israelis to move on these issues, to move on settlements, to move on borders. He'll be able to push them for us. And obviously that prediction didn't go the way he saw it going, but there is sort of this idea that we're not going to necessarily, as Dr. Salhami just said, have the political risk. We want the Americans to go through the political risk and sort of extract concessions from the Israelis for us and change that reality vis-a-vis their relationship with the Israelis.
And regarding political risk, I know that Dr. Tahami has done a lot of research, more probably than anybody else, about public opinion among Palestinians. And I would be interested to know, if you take, for example, Arafat's sentence that he was quoted in Camp David as one at the end when it came to him saying, no, I'm not going to sign anything. Do you want me to come back in a coffin or something to that effect, that he was worried that if he were to sign that agreement, he would not survive. The question is, where does Abbas stand in that regard? How much does he care about Palestinian public opinion? You mentioned he's a little aloof and not as connected. 2, how much does he fear any concession would be viewed by public opinion? How do you tie that into the fact that he's frequently been recorded as saying one thing to the international media and one thing in Arabic to the Palestinian public? How does that reflect what he thinks that the public expects him to say? And then the last one is not only the overall public, but there are also different other younger leaders in Fatah and Hamas as well. How does all of those play into what he's doing? Because how much of that is really, how much is he bound by what he perceives as the public? And the last question I have is, in the same context, is what do you believe the Palestinian public really most care about? Would they care most about, because that would be reflected in that, would they care most about, they want finally to see an end to Israeli occupation, have their own state, and or do they care about the details of an agreement, meaning, yes, will there be, what level of right of return will there be, or what part of Jerusalem will they get, or what percent of land will they get? I know it's a little, maybe it's too
well, that's a lot of questions.
all of that is basically.
But let me just make a couple of points related to that. First, about Arafat and Camp David, and what he said about, I might be killed if I agree to what you're offering. By the way, Barak said the same thing. He said, if I agree to that, my fate will be like Rabin. So they both used it as a lever with Clinton. So that was not, and they use it as leverage, and they use it figuratively speaking. I don't think they mean it literally. I think it's a question of, they will throw me out of here because nobody will accept that. And I think that is a fear in the sense of accepting legitimacy, because not just for Arafat, obviously for Mahmoud Abbas too. For Arafat specifically at the time, I think a lot of people don't understand that the biggest obstacle to peace at Camp David was actually Jerusalem. A lot of the other issues were not even discussed. Certainly the refugee issue wasn't discussed. Right of return was hardly discussed. Even the landscape was discussed about withdrawals and so forth. But But the Jerusalem issue is what derailed it. And at the time, people didn't understand how big the Jerusalem issue was to the Palestinians. I actually wrote 2 pieces, one just before Camp David for the LA Times saying the negotiations are going to fail over Jerusalem. And then the first week of Camp David, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post arguing that that's going to be the case. And before the negotiations, I went to see Rob Malley at the White House saying, your expectation on Jerusalem, you're not focused on Jerusalem enough. Later, Arafat said, quote, if they had given me Jerusalem, I would have given them a lot more of the West Bank. It was just figuratively speaking. He was not obviously being, they didn't understand how important Jerusalem is. I think that's the same with Mahmoud Abbas. I think one reason why people didn't understand how big a move this Jerusalem issue was psychologically, it's very hard for him to go back to the negotiations if Jerusalem off the table. It's impossible for him. But nobody would let him. Not even his aides, not even his assistants would sign on to it. It wouldn't happen. So there are red lines. The question is, what are the red lines beyond that? I mean, that's a big issue. We know what Palestinians expect. One reason why I think the two-state solution was kept alive, despite the fact that most people think it's never going to happen, because both Israelis and Palestinians say, roughly half or now, and the majorities say they accept the two-state solution. But when you ask them, is it likely to happen, majority states would say it's not. So they're pessimistic, and yet they stick with it. And part of it is because it solves a problem for them. They don't know exactly what to put on the table. So Palestinians, why don't they just advocate a one-state solution? Because they don't think it's going to happen. And so instead, and the two-state, and it doesn't solve a lot of problems like the right of return issue, because at Camp David, when they talked about right of return, they talked about the possibility of Palestinians going back to the Palestinian state, not necessarily to Israel. Well, if you're not going to have a Palestinian state, there's no right of return idea that's going to be implemented. So there's a lot of tension going on in the Palestinians. Certainly people expect sovereignty. They don't want to see Israeli troops. They don't want to see them around, and they don't want to see them when they leave the country. They don't want to be dependent on Israelis. So they want sovereignty. They want contiguity, obviously. They want viability. So I think how you play with that is another story.
I'll build off that with regards to public opinion and polling, and I'll caveat it with it's very easy, I think, to slip into broad generalizations when you talk about what a certain people want, especially with American policymakers talking about the Middle East. I will say that in general, consistently a majority of Palestinians have wanted Abbas to go for a couple of years now. A number of his policies are deeply unpopular. The cybercrimes law from last summer, where the PA forces can arrest over Facebook posts, is incredibly unpopular. Social Security agreements that the PA has sort of defaulted on sparked protest, as did teacher protests. And PA forces arresting the heads of teacher unions and civil societies have made sort of the PA quite unpopular. That being said, it's not as if there's a huge galvanizing force charging and marching for him to go. I think there's disappointment in Abbas. If I was categorizing and lumping in and falling into that trap, I would say that there's probably broad disappointment with Abbas, but also some level of empathy there. I think a majority of Palestinians feel as if he's been dealt a pretty sour hand that he's tried, and I think there's also sort of a recognition of what he represents. And you also see that at the highest political levels, there are people around him that certainly want to be the next guy. None of them are going to act against him right now. They're just going to sort of wait until he's no longer the president to sort of make their move. I also think in general, Palestinians want what anybody wants, and that's jobs and access to healthcare and quality of life. I do think that because there is some level of a middle class, especially in Ramallah, you don't see the numbers of Palestinians take to the streets as you have in the past. What happened in Jerusalem was centered around Jerusalem and Jerusalemites, but when a day of rage is called in Ramallah, it's mostly people staying at home, and there's not a ton of numbers that go out. There's the usual clashes at the checkpoints and whatnot, but I think it's a combination of people really don't feel as if the political leadership is bought into the popular the popular protests and whatnot, and there's also sort of a quasi comfortability with that middle class right now. But in general, I do think it's that sort of lower middle class, upper middle class section of society that is openly questioning the two-state parameters of its leadership and openly questioning whether or not Abbas's platform is a sustainable platform going forward, and whether or not they should be embracing other things like a binational project, a one-man, one vote, what have you. But that is, I think, maybe in a nutshell where I would place and try to answer a couple of those questions.
Two questions that I'm sure you're asked all the time, so you must have answers. First of all, why the title? Why the last Palestinian? I can guess, but there must be a reason. Second, what insights can you give us about the succession question? Obviously, no one knows, but with all the rumors about Abbas's bad health, he's 81. What do you think might be a likely process?
I'll answer on the title and let Grant take a stab at the succession. The first reason that we chose this title was because our publisher said that the previous title was terrible and we needed to think of a better one.
What was that?
There were a number of versions. They were all bad.
This is a pretty good title, though. I mean,
Yes.
it's captured.
And we went with this one for a number of reasons. First of all, because Abbas is the last really prominent and active member of a founding generation of Palestinian national politics. If you look today at the leadership, the people who are in power and the people who will come to power maybe after him, there is nobody who was actually involved in the kind of events that he was involved in, and has that biography that stretches back to the early years of Fatah, PLO. Another main reason is also because of what he represents as a person in the Palestinian story, in the arc. We're talking here about someone who was born in Safed, in Palestine, the British Mandate, became a refugee at the age of 13, experienced the Nakba and experienced the life of the refugees, moving between refugee camps, between states, and went to work like many Palestinians, in the 50s in the Gulf, looking for a job, for education, for a future, joined the national movement and became an activist, although not a very, let's say, not a very combative activist, but still an activist as a student, and grew up with the movement and in the movement, and then took part in the earliest negotiations with the Israelis, and eventually came to Gaza and to the West Bank with Oslo, and rose to the position of the leader of the national movement and the president of the PA. And whoever comes after him is not going to have that kind of life story that stretches back to Palestine under the Mandate and to the experience of the refugees. Most likely it's going to be someone who was born in the West Bank or in Gaza after 67 and certainly after 48. And Abbas can also claim, and you can argue whether it's a true claim or not, but he can claim to speak for the entire Palestinian people because of that biography, because he is a refugee, because he's lived in Gaza and in the West Bank and abroad, and so he can speak for the diaspora and for the people in the West Bank and in Gaza. To some extent, even the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and the people inside the 48 borders. That's not an experience that he has lived under Israeli control, but he has lived in Safed for 13 years. He has strong memories from the Galilee and from traveling in the region. And the next leader is not going to have that kind of biography and that kind of representation and symbolicness. And that's why we thought this was a very good way to capture him. And the last thing I would say, it was also a bit of a tribute to a very good article that Hussein Arab, we talked about, published about Arafat in 2005, I think, or late 2004, around the time of Arafat's death. He titled it "The Last Palestinian," and he talked about Arafat being the last, real Palestinian leader. And he said, now we will have Abbas. It's a totally different kind of politician. It's not a fighter. It's not someone who wears military garb. It's a bureaucrat with a suit and tie. And I think Abbas has surprised some people in the way that he's conducted his politics and the way that he led the national movement. And this was also a bit of a tribute in that regard to that article, which was really helpful in shaping for us the transformation from Arafat to Abbas.
Yeah, and also the last anything always sounds super cool. The last samurai, the last Jedi. Yeah, that always works. Well, thank you, Paul, for the question, and also I should thank you for setting this up today. It's a joy to be here, and that's in large part because of you. So thank you for that. The succession issue is, I think, the most important game in town right now when it comes to Palestinian politics. I will caveat it. You did say that Abbas's, his health is up for debate right now. I'm a little uncomfortable with all the speculation about his health, but it's certainly true that he does turn 83 in a couple of days here. He has had a number of heart operations, and he was recently overnighted at Johns Hopkins. It's not clear what's happening. Again, I certainly don't like to speculate about it, but when you talk with people around him, it's clear that his health is deteriorating in some sense. And so that brings some urgency to the question of who comes after him. When Arafat passed away in 2004, what happened was they followed the PA basic law, and that was that power would go to the Speaker of the PA's parliament for 60 days, elections would be held, and a new president of the PA would be sworn in. That was fine when it was Rafi Fatah, Speaker of Parliament. Obviously, that's not the case now because of 2006. The Speaker is Aziz Dweik, he's a member of Hamas, and there's not a strong likelihood that Fatah will see its leader and president of the PA pass away or retire and then hand power over to Hamas in a defunct parliament for 60 days, let alone 60 minutes. To that extent, there's been sort of a question mark of what happens. In 2016, Abbas created a 9-member constitutional court that the Palestinian Legal Society has argued can act as sort of a rubber stamp in the event, or even as sort of a placeholder for power for 60 days while elections are held. That is obviously not a consensus opinion because it's still kept purposely murky. I think the first, I'll caveat this with, it all depends on how he vacates the scene. If he decides to step down and appoint somebody, if something happens, and if it's sudden. The first decision I think the Palestinian leaders will have to make is whether or not they want to have elections. I don't think there's any clear takeaway of which way they'd want to go. My sense is, given that there's the divide between the West Bank and Gaza, and the inability to have elections in Gaza because of Hamas, that they will not rush forward with elections. In that case, they have pointed to, more recently I've heard a lot of talk about what happened in 1989 when the PLO Executive Committee named Arafat as president of the State of Palestine in waiting. It was ratified by the Central Council and a session of the PNC, and he was able to be president from the time the PA was created in 94 to the time when they had their first elections in 96. He was able to be president without actually having to go and compete for elections. So there is a sense that there is sort of a precedent for having someone replace Abbas who doesn't immediately go to the ballot box. But I think there will also be a lot of people who will want to see elections, or candidates who will want to have elections. And first and foremost will be Marwan Barghouti, the imprisoned Fatah leader, whose popularity is really unassailable, and who will certainly advocate for elections because he comes in first in a lot of those public opinion polls. He came in first in the Central Committee's voting in 2016. His wife came in first in the Revolutionary Council's voting. I mean, he is quite popular, and a source of his popularity is undoubtedly his biography, but also his standing in prison. There will be others who will argue that he cannot rule and thus that because he cannot get out of prison, he's ineligible or he can't be president, and that they should be the extension. One of those is Jibril Rajoub, who came in second in those internal voting, and who certainly sees himself as the next guy and has not so quietly made his campaign known. Another is Mahmoud al-Alul Abu Jihad, who's most recently the first acting vice president of Fatah. I interviewed him in December and published an interview last week with him. I think he has charted a course that Abbas likes, and Abbas right now seems to look at him as a potential successor and is trying to advance him quietly. And then there are other figures like Mohammed Dahlan, who shows up. It's not an actual conspiracy in the Middle East if Dahlan isn't somehow involved. He shows up everywhere. He was exiled in 2011. He was in charge of security in Gaza, and Abbas sort of hung that defeat around his head. He now makes his home in the UAE, and he's quite close with the Egyptians and obviously the Emiratis, and he spreads his money around and cuts deals everywhere. Look, in general, I will sum up by saying if you were trying to succeed Mahmoud Abbas right now, there are a couple of different ways to go about it. There is the openly confrontational, which is what Dahlan is doing from the UAE, where you are blasting him at every turn, talking about creating a fringe wing within Fatah, or perhaps even your own party, however unlikely. There is contesting Abbas within Fatah and within the organs, like Rajoub, to an extent like Marwan, where you're not really criticizing him, but you're distinguishing yourself and you're taking the sort of public appearances and symbolic gestures that would make you seem like a candidate. And then there's what Alul, this sort of newcomer, is doing, and that is to be basically quiet and to make your positions quietly known, but to be supportive of Abbas and to not be too much of a threat. That was a very long-winded answer to the succession question, which basically can be summed up by we don't really know. And I don't think we can at this point rule anyone out. Abbas was a virtual unknown when the PA was created to many Palestinians, and he was sort of viewed as a toothless bureaucrat when he was the prime minister. It was, in fact, his resignation as prime minister that endeared him to a lot of members of the Palestinian ruling elite, and ultimately when Arafat went, that sort of admiration led to his selection as the successor. So you don't necessarily have to have the biggest profile or be the most famous to be the successor, but I ultimately, I don't think any of us really know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, let's think of it a little bit differently, particularly for someone who doesn't know much about the Palestinian situation. Think of it as a puzzle, and the puzzle must have a solution. And the solution takes place within the context of political discourse, not who does what or what the resources are available or how intelligent the leader is. Now, it seems to me that, looking at the history of the Palestinian movement, is that one fundamental aspect of the Palestinian struggle has been violence. And that has been violence, engaged in political violence, particularly Hamas. I mean, when I occasionally discuss with Israelis, why you guys keep voting for Bibi Netanyahu, he said, well, look what Hamas does, In the same way that, the violence of, Muslim extremists contribute to the rise of nationalism in Europe and also in the United States. So it seems to me that, the puzzle of politics, if you, Marxists and other, group who engage in violence at some point come to the conclusion that it doesn't work, and they abandon this, in Iran, in Latin America, and other places. But it seems to me that among Palestinians, there hasn't been really a serious discussion on this issue of, if this is a legitimate means, is it an effective means of bringing about, and why nobody really thought of drawing lesson from Gandhi, for example, engaging in peaceful demonstration, in peaceful manner, trying to establish some sort of a alliance with peaceful Israelis.
Well, there's actually a lot of discourse about that. That's not, there is, this is debated day in and day out, and there are alliances between, progressive Israelis and Palestinians, and there've been many demonstrations and many episodes. You watch the movie Budros, for example, the film on that aspect. That's really, I think, if you look at it, I would not characterize the Palestinian strategy under occupation, meaning since '67, to have been violent. In fact, the first Intifada doesn't emerge until 1987, 20 years after the Israeli occupation. And there was very little. There was actually rather political and more acquiescence for 20 years, and they got nowhere. And then and the Arab world started forgetting him because of the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, and the Palestinians go out. And even then, the 1987 Intifada was not violent in the same way that the 2000 Palestinian Intifada became, because it was mostly throwing stones. Yes, that was the birth time of Hamas. Hamas is born then at the same time as an organization. It wasn't even there, and then it, things changed. So I wouldn't characterize it as principally a violent strategy. Certainly after Oslo, there were groups that were using it, but that was not a principal strategy of the Palestinians. And after the collapse of 2000, which I think has been the biggest setback for Arab-Israeli peace, period. This is, in the 1990s, there was a genuine opportunity, and people didn't understand the strategic importance of succeeding in 2000. But in 2000, when that's failed, and actually the book talks about this pretty well, because they point out that Mahmoud Abbas himself was very much against violence and went against Arafat directly. It's not that Arafat started the Intifada. Arafat embraced it. It started spontaneously in 2000, but he decided it was strategically useful, and he embraced it. And Abu Mazen, and he wasn't the only one, but he clearly was very, very consistent from day one to tell Arafat that was not a wise strategy. And he stuck with it, pretty much. It's not that that he's been extremely successful, but under the circumstances, his strategy, really, since he came to power, has not been that. Hamas is a different story, obviously, but their operations have been, in recent years, have been limited mostly to Gaza, and that has been addressed more or less directly with, we haven't seen the kind of suicide attacks that they used to conduct. Multiple reasons for it. The Israelis have been good at preventing them. They also haven't been useful for them. So I wouldn't say that the Palestinian strategy has been principally violence. In fact, it's been a mixed strategy with mixed results. And the 1987, I think the 1987 Intifada, you can argue, was pretty successful, because it put them on the map, it created much more legitimacy, and it created a pressure on Israel, and legitimacy in the international community, sympathy with the Palestinians, to the point that I think it was part of the consideration in 1993 when Yitzhak Rabin came to power, to think about sort of what are the options. Well, what are we facing? Because it was an uncomfortable situation. You have to deal with it one way or the other, and the PLO jumped on. They were weakened because of the Iraq War, the 1991 Iraq War, and their own position, and they jumped on the side of an agreement rather than confrontation.
I want to add something on Abbas and violence. One of the interesting discussions that we have in the book, and we can't really make a conclusion about it because there are different arguments, and I think all of them are valid, has to do with 2005, with the Israeli disengagement from Gaza. One of Abbas's complaints against the Israeli government at the time, the government of Ariel Sharon, he basically said, the way you are conducting this unilateral disengagement without any kind of written agreement with the Palestinian Authority, without some ceremony of handing the keys and the power, just taking out your military, taking out your settlements, and not giving Abbas any formal credit or responsibility, he claimed that it was helpful to Hamas and that it sent a wrong message that violence achieves better results than negotiations. He basically said, if you had done it as some part of an agreement, I could come to my people and say, look what negotiations have brought us. Through negotiations, through peaceful dialogue, I have taken the Israelis out of Gaza. And he claimed that instead what happened is that Hamas came to the Palestinian people, said, look what we have achieved, not Abbas. This is not negotiations. This has nothing to do with peace talks. This was through our attacks inside the settlements and in the military bases and maybe attacks that came from Gaza into Israel, and we pushed them back. I can also see the argument against it, which was that Sharon believed that any kind of coordinated move with the Palestinians would be much less popular on the Israeli street and would basically not allow him to actually carry out the disengagement, which was the most important step. And I'm, again, a bit biased on this because I believe the disengagement was a very important step that Israel had to do for its own survival. I don't know what Israel would have done. We already have such a problematic situation today with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I can't even imagine where we would be if we were still controlling 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza. It would be a total disaster. So I can understand Sharon saying, I'm going to pull out, I'm going to do it in the most efficient way for me. I'm going to do it in a way that I can verify it will actually happen and will have broad public support. And whatever happens in Gaza itself is a problem of Abu Mazen, not of Sharon. I can also see Abu Mazen's argument that he said the way you did this, basically ignoring me, Abu Mazen, was actually sent the message that violence achieves more than negotiations. And that's one of the dilemmas on these issues. And I think it is right to give Abbas credit, and we do in the book, not only for standing up to Arafat during the Second Intifada, but also for really, in different points in time, insisting on the security coordination with Israel, and in the face of a lot of backlash. And of course, there is the Israeli argument that he also benefits from it, which is true. But he also loses from it. It's not that he benefits from it in the sense that it might help him against Hamas and to stay in power, but he also loses a ton of popularity and public opinion about it. And those are the areas where he does, I think, deserve the credit. You can ask whether it can work if he doesn't bring any achievements on the diplomatic side, because he says, what's my alternative to violence? Negotiations or going to the UN? You can argue that both have not really led to significant progress for the people that he governs, and that's where we're stuck.
I think we have to end at this
pretty much.
point. It's at 5:30, and I think that's a contract with you that we bring you this and end more or less on the time. So thanks very much to all.